Hi, I'm Liz, and we are at EMOs Creative Studio, where anything and everything you create is beautiful because you created it. In today's video tutorial, I'm going to show you how to do a French seam and a variation of a French seam. So if you look behind me, French seams, what I use them for is to make and finish off the seams inside of pouches and bags. And as you can see with this one, when I started making pouches and bags, I was leaving them with the raw edges like this. And this is very unsightly to me, and I can just imagine what a customer would think and say if you were making these to sell, what they would think and say, that it's not professional looking. So in watching some of the other YouTube videos, I noticed that people were finishing off the edges of their seams on the inside, and this is what an actual French seam would look like. It really looks nice, it's professional, it's finished. Now the reason I have these done in a contrasting color is because I want some pop, plus I wanted for you to see what the seams look like. So this is a little cosmetic or pencil bag that you see here. I have another little bag right here with a wristlet, and you can see that it's finished on the inside. It doesn't look unsightly and ugly. You don't have threads that are unraveling and coming out. Now the variation of the French seam is what I did with this one, and this is a crossbody little bag. And I started off the French seam this way, but instead of finishing the seam off on the inside, I modified it and I made the seam on the outside. So why don't we get started? So here we are. We are going to start off with showing you the right and wrong side of fabric. And the first thing I'm going to show you after that is how to actually make the French seam the correct way. Then after that, I'm going to show you how I modified it, and then after that I'm going to show you how I modified it in a second way. So I have two pieces of fabric here. If you are a sewer, you know that when you make a seam, you're putting the bright or right sides, which is this, facing each other. And if you turn your fabric over, you'll notice that the dull or not so bright sides are the inside. So this is the right side, this is the wrong side. So when you normally do sewing, you put your right sides together, and then you pin it or you clip it, or however you put your seams together and sew. When you are doing a French seam, what you're doing is you're putting the wrong sides together. So you want to see the bright or correct sides or pretty sides, or however you want to call it. So I have my back sides, wrong sides together. I'm matching up the seams. I'm going to go ahead and pin it. For those of you that are still new and still need to have pins to hold your edges together. When you are doing a French seam, you need to make a 1/2 inch seam allowance. For a French seam done in the correct way, you need to make a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I have my machine set at number 2 for stitches, so I'm going to show you the very first part, or the second part, of putting together a French seam. So I'm going to go ahead and sew it. You pull out your pins, make sure you don't have your fingers in the way. And now you've completed the first part of your French seam. As you can see, this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. What you're going to do is you're going to go to your iron, you're going to iron open. No, actually what you're going to do is when you are doing the French seam in the correct manner, they want you to cut off a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now if you notice right here, we have a lot of fraying edges. So the purpose in cutting off the 1/4 inch seam allowance is to try to make sure that you don't get those frayed edges. Now I'm going to pink it, or use my pinking shears to make sure that I get rid of the frayed edges. So I'm going to estimate that this is a 1/4 inch, or I'm cutting off half of the seam allowance. And do it like that, and do it like that, and now I've cut it off. Now I'm going to go to my iron and I'm going to iron it open. Choose a side that you want your seam to be on. Usually it's the dark side, because I want to do this in one seam. I'm not going to go to the iron. I just want you to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to use my fingers to finger press this open. Now my right sides will be matching together as you fold open your seams, as you see right here. Because I didn't use an iron to press it open, I am going to insert pins because I want to make sure that I get a very nicely done seam. Again, I sewed my 2 pieces of fabric, wrong sides together, cut off a 1/4 inch from the seam allowance. I sewed it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, cut off a 1/4 inch, and then folded it over, pressed it, pinned it, and now I'm going to put it back under the needle. And again, I am going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That will allow for the seam to be caught inside of the seam allowance. Again, we remove our pins. And we start sewing. I have completed my French seam. When you look at your item this way, you'll see that it's nicely done, nice straight seam. And then inside there are no raw or jagged edges or frayed edges. Now I'm going to turn the fabric over and I'm going to show you how I do my French seam. So I'm always one to look for not so much an easier way to do things, but an easier way to do things, maybe remove a step. So when I'm doing my French seam, I sew it at a 1/4 inch so I don't have to be cutting anything. Now I may end up trimming off these frayed edges right here just to get rid of the string so that they don't come through, but I'm trying to eliminate steps. So here I go. My back sides are facing each other with the right side facing me. I'm going to go ahead and make my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Cut it. Now I don't cut my thread. I don't need to cut anything unless I want to get rid of this frayed edge right here. So I'll probably run the scissors really quickly across to get rid of these little strings that are hanging out all over the place. I'm going to turn my fabric over, matching right sides together. I'm going to go to my iron and I'm going to iron open the seam. And then I will place a couple of pins in so that I have a nice clean, because I didn't actually go to the iron, I'm going to put a couple of pins in to hold this open. This step, I am going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance because I want to trap that 1/4 inch seam inside the seam here. And you sew it. Now you see, this is my modified side. When you open the inside, there are no frayed edges hanging out. It's nice and clean. Now this side is the actual way that you should be doing your French seam. Now, when you are doing a French seam for any kind of item, with the exception of quilting or blankets, because I don't think you can do it on quilts. I've never seen anybody do it or talk about it. You need to adjust for the seam allowance. If you are actually going to do the 1/2 inch first sewing, 1/2 inch second sewing, that means each side is going to have 1 inch of seam allowance with the first stitching and the second stitching. So that means that you're going to have to add 2 inches, 1 inch on each side, to allow for the seam allowance. If you do it the way I do it, with the 1/4 inch and then a 1/2 inch, then you have to allow 3/4 of an inch for each side. Again, if you're going to do the French seam the way you're supposed to, doing the first stitching at a 1/2 inch and then the second stitching at a 1/2 inch, that's 1 inch seam allowance. So you need 1 inch for each side added on to your finished size. If you're going to do the way I do it, with a 1/4 inch first sewing and a 1/2 inch second sewing, 1/2 inch and a 1/4 inch equals 3/4 of an inch. So you're going to allow for 3/4 of an inch on either side of your item that you're working on, so that you have enough seam allowance. I hope you're able to understand that. So let's move on to another modification that I've done. Okay, first of all, this is a new day. This will be the 4th time that I'm trying to videotape this portion of the tutorial. So, when you're having problems like I was having with the thread and the tension, you just need to get up and walk away from your project so that you could start off fresh. So, let's continue. This is the 3rd way of doing a modified French hem. I have 2 pieces of fabric that are cut, and I'm going to make this into some kind of pouch. I'm not sure if I'm going to be using it as a zippered pouch or if I'm going to be using it as a pouch with a flap. What I've done is this fabric with the paisley print, I'm using this as a lining, and I ironed on a fusible fleece to it. Again, when you're doing your French seam, you're putting the wrong sides together so that you can sew. I've also marked or delineated where I want to start and stop, because I need to stick my hand in to pull it out, pull it inside out. So because I'm going to do this, I need to make sure that I backstitch at the beginning and at the end of my sewing, so that I'm not ripping apart the stitching that I did because I'm sticking my hand in there. So let's go ahead and see if this time I'm going to have a good sewing experience. I'm doing this as a 1/4 of an inch using the edge of my walking foot as a guide, because my walking foot is indeed a 1/4 inch from the needle. I take a look, and yes, my stitching is finally, hallelujah, working out correctly. As I have suggested in several of my videos, if you're new to sewing, make sure that you put pins in so that you are keeping your fabrics equal and even. Also, you want to go slow on your sewing to make sure that you maintain your 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch seam allowance. Granted that the machine I'm using is a professional machine and I can get this thing to go up to 1,500 stitches a minute, but I don't want to have crooked sewing because even though I consider myself an experienced novice, I still have to watch my seam allowances because I tend to, if I go fast, I tend to sew crooked. Here I am coming up to the second turn, and again I'm making sure that I stop at the 1/4 inch line right here. I turn this, pull out the pin because I don't want to sew over the pin and break my needle, and here we go. Alright, I've completed. I'm going to pull all the pins out. I'm going to find my little scissors and I'm going to cut this and throw the threads away, pull this out, and now I've sewn all the way around a 1/4 inch. So now what I want to do is what I want to do first is I want to clip my corners so that I get a nice point when I'm turning my item inside out. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. Sorry, you can't see that one. I had it kind of on the low side. Alright, so what I want to do is I want to stick my hand in, make sure that I'm not putting stress at the ends, and I'm going to pull this through. Gently pull it because I don't want to put any stress on the beginning or the end of my stitching. Pulling it through very gently. Pulling it through very gently. Now I'm going to stick my hand back in and I'm just going to push it. Oh, look at that. Like that. I'm going to have to pull it through and re-sew it. Tisk tisk. Pull that there. Pull this here. One more corner. I'm going to pull it. Alright, so I need to fix this faux pas that I did over here. Sorry you can't see what I'm doing, I'm just pulling it out a little. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward this repair that I'm doing for that hole that I discovered because I did not match my fabric up perfectly. As you see, I am fiddling around with the machine to make sure that I get the 2 pieces in there. And I'm just going to go ahead and sew it up. Alright, let me stick my hand back in and maybe I did catch it and fix it. Stick my hand back in. Now let's see if you're going to see my fingers again or not. Alright, I got it. What you'll do is you'll take this to your ironing board and you will iron it so that it's flat. Now remember, you're seeing the white side because I have an interfacing to give it some body, to give my bag some body. I want to make sure that my seam is good and smash down. I'm going to insert a couple of pins just to make sure that when I'm sewing, I'm not going to be sewing it all discombobulated or wonky. And here I'm just adding my pins in because I'm not taking the fabric to the ironing board. I want to make sure that I sew this evenly. I want to be able to still stick my hand through to pull it through, so I'm going to leave that space open. My original space I'm going to leave open. And I'm going to continue pinning so that I can sew and make my secondary seam in my French seam. Alright, so now I'm done pinning and I'm going to place this underneath my needle, and this seam is going to be a 1/2 inch. Again, I'm going to back stitch the beginning and end of my stitching so that when I'm pulling it through with my hand inside, I'm not going to rip open the stitching. Now I want to make sure that I turn this at 1/2 inch. There's a 1/2 inch right there, and here we go. I'm rounding around to my 4th corner, and as you see, I did sew over a pin. It's not recommended. I was really lucky that my needle didn't break because I was busy giving myself a signal that I'm coming to the 4th corner. I'm actually giving you a signal that I was coming to the 4th corner. And now I'm coming up to the pin where I'm going to back stitch my opening. And you see I did a 1/2 inch all the way around. You see? Now I'm going to go ahead and stick my hand in. Now if I wanted to, I'm going to clip the corners so that it lays nicely. It's not going to affect anything. As you can see, I'm cutting off the bulk, trying to make sure that I don't get anywhere near the stitching. So let's stick our hand in, and I'm going to very gently, even though it looks like I'm being a ruffian, push through my lining, my outer shell, and my interfacing, fleeced interfacing. This time I am going to stick in a tool that I use to push out my corners. I'll first push them out with my finger. Push it out with my finger. Go up here, and I'm going to push it out with my finger. All right, and the tool that I use is a wooden chopstick. You can go to any Asian restaurant, or when you go to an Asian restaurant, they offer chopsticks. They put it on your placemat. It's part of what they give you, especially if you go to the areas, to the neighborhoods that have these restaurants. I've picked up a couple. I've got my chopsticks. These are much safer to push through your corners. They don't rip through the fabric. They're pointy, but they're not pointy enough to have you break through the fabric. I used to do this with scissors, and my scissor would pop through. And there I am wondering what the heckaroonie I'm going to do to fix it. Okay, wait. My hand's too big in this point. All right. Now to get my chopstick out. All right, so here we are with a finished product with my seams. I'll take this over to my ironing board and I'll iron everything down nice and flat. So when I make my bag, I can sew it with the seams showing on the outside. Let's see where I can do this. Right here. With the seams on the outside, and you'll see a finished edge like this. Or if I'm going to do a bag with a zipper, I'll place the zipper up here and then sew my seam here so that when you turn it inside out, the seam will be finished. It'll look like this somehow, or with the seam finished. So I've gone ahead and I've ironed it to make the seam flat all the way around, and I've decided that I'm going to make this into a zippered pouch. So what that means is I'm going to be making this seam on the inside. In another tutorial, I'll show you how to insert the zipper so that everything looks professionally completed, that there are no raw edges or any frayed edges. So my name is Liz. We are at EMOs Creative Studio, where anything and everything you create is beautiful because you created it. Like, subscribe, share with your friends and social media. I have an email address of fancythingsindeed@gmail.com. I also have a Facebook page, capital E, capital M, capital O, small s, space Liz. Happy quilting, happy sewing, and until the next time, see ya. Bye. This means I shouldn't be doing this.